Hi, I'm Taylor Williams, and today I'm going to go over my lesson plan, section 1 through 3. Okay. So the standards that I chose to do my lesson on were the biology standard HE 4B3, which falls into hereditary and evolution. And that standard is use the laws of probability and Punnett squares to predict genotypic and phenotypic ratios. The math standard that I chose to pair with it is HSSICA 1, and that standard is from Algebra 2, and it's to recognize statistics as a process for making inferences about population parameters based on a sample from that population. I thought these standards paired really well with each other because through Punnett squares we're able to get ratios that can predict our population and the genes that our population shows. Okay, so my objectives for this lesson are that students will be able to fill out Punnett squares and be able to read the results. Students will be able to define the differences between genotypic and phenotypic ratios. And students will be able to take those results and make inferences on our population. I have chosen these objectives because I want the students to know the two types of results that we're finding, which are the genotypic and phenotypic. And also I've chosen these objectives because students need to know not only how to find the results, but how to apply them in real-world situations, which would be looking at our population. Student grouping. For this project, my students will begin the lesson as a whole group. I think that whole grouping is the most effective way to explain concepts and give clear and concise instructions to the class. Then students will break off for a class activity. For class activities, I like to pair like-minded students or students that complement one another, and that'll play more into like our students with 504 plans and EEPs. Following the class activity, I will bring the class back together so that we can have a classroom discussion. And finally, if the students are ready, I'll ask them to do an individual assignment so I can assess their knowledge on the concept. I've chosen this type of grouping to maximize learning potential in the classroom. Whole grouping at the beginning is a great way to explain the concepts that you're going over without cutting into a large majority of your class. Instead of moving from group to group and having to explain the same thing, it's just easier if you have the whole class right there together. It also allows me to explain the instructions, hopefully only once, for the partnered activity so that the entire class can hear them. Students will be partnered off for the activity because partnering still puts a significant amount of responsibility on each student. Typically when you get in groups of 3 or 4, you have 1 to 2 people doing the majority of the work, whereas partnership, you're in there 50-50, so you still have to work, and that's why I put no slackers in parentheses. But also, you know, instead of being by themselves or working on it individually, it does offer them another mind to think along with. So if they are struggling, they still have someone to lean on while we're still getting the hang of it. After the group activity, we come back to whole grouping because it allows me to go over the activity with the class. It allows me to see my students' strengths and their weaknesses, and just go over and briefly discuss the content again before they're tested on it, just to make sure everybody has the hang of it. Assessing students individually allows me to see if each student has a grasp on it, and it allows me to make any modifications that any student needs to their assessment. Okay, moving on to section 3. Okay, methods. The methods that I will be using for this lesson are lecture with discussion, partner activities, report back sessions, Marzano's third strategy, which is cooperative learning, the explicit teaching method, and individual assessment. I chose lecture and discussion because it allows me to cover the concepts that I need to go over at the beginning of class. I chose lecture with discussion so that the students have an opportunity to ask questions before they break into pairs. Marzano's third strategy falls in with the partner activity and the report back session that I've included. I chose a partner activity so that students can fill out Punnett squares on their own, but also have another student to collaborate with. Once the pairs have completed their assignment, then we come back to the report back session. I chose this method so that we can see if there's any areas where students struggled and where they succeeded, because it's always good to build them up after they've done something, but before they have an individual assessment. The report back session also allows me to see if my students are ready for their individual assessment. Pending that I felt like we covered everything in this class and the class is ready, I will give them an individual assessment, and I chose an individual assessment so that I can see that where each student is ready to move on and that we can build onto this knowledge. Okay, and that is it for sections 1 through 3.